All right, you guys can see my screen, right? Not playing myself again.
Yeah, we can see it.
Awesome, thank you. So today I'm going to train you up on Qualtrics. By this point, hopefully you are able to log into Qualtrics and see that you're capable of creating a new survey. The way to do that is to initially log on to Qualtrics, and then I submit a request to sponsor your account, and then IT approves it. So if you've gone through all those steps, now when you log into Qualtrics, you should see that you're capable of creating new surveys. And I went through and I added everyone that I was able to onto a sample survey that I've created to give you a sense of what a fully formed survey should look like. I could only add you to the sample survey if you did have your sponsored account already confirmed. So if you're unable to see my sample survey, please let me know. But on my end, I'm going to be showing you some features of Qualtrics. I'm going to show you some general information, and then again, I'm going to show you the sample survey. I do encourage you to kind of follow along and make a practice survey. It doesn't have to be the thing that becomes your actual survey, but you can create little mock surveys just to practice creating different sorts of questions, different certain approaches to programming. So I do encourage you to kind of follow along with me if you do have your fully privileged account set up. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the major components of creating a Qualtrics survey, the sort of basic info that you need to know. Again, it's all pretty user-friendly stuff that you might be able to hash out on your own, but I do want to make sure that we sort of have a good baseline. You should create a practice survey that you can do individually. You can always get together with your group mates or just any other classmates and create a practice survey just for shits and giggles to get a little bit of practice. Then what you should do, and this should be a goal by the end of the day, is you're going to want to create the Qualtrics shell that will eventually become your actual survey. You don't need to have finalized your survey materials yet. You still have a couple more days for that, and you need more feedback from me. You don't need to begin programming it today. All you need to do is get some practice and then create the shell that will ultimately become your survey, and you need to name it. I recommend naming your surveys something that has to do with your project idea. The title of the survey participants will not see, so you can name it like self-esteem and social media. Participants won't see the title. I would recommend naming it something intuitive regarding your project idea, because that'll help me be able to find your survey later. Then additionally, and this is very important, you need to share the survey that you create as the shell that will become your survey with me and with all your group mates. This is going to be really, really important to give full collaborative privileges to your group mates and to me, because that will allow all of us to see the survey, make edits, etc. Okay, so in order to go to Qualtrics at this point, you go back to that same login screen. It's just that when you log in, you'll now see that you should have the capability to create a blank survey, and you should hopefully be able to see the sample survey that I shared with you. Right, so the same login screen that you went to initially log in, you just go back. And you should be able to see your dashboard. So my dashboard is full of a million surveys from semesters past and the sample survey that I always use as my instructional materials. You will likely not see anything on your dashboard except maybe the sample survey that I've shared with you, but you should now see your ability to create a blank survey. Your options are to create a completely blank survey from scratch, or you can create from existing. Now, the only thing you'll have is the sample survey, but for example, you could copy my sample survey sort of wholesale and use that as a template to make your survey, just replacing the materials from the sample survey with your own material. So you can do that. You can create a new survey from a pre-existing survey that you have. This becomes very useful if you're doing research and you have sort of a similar research method that you use. You just sort of switch out your scales and questions. But I would probably recommend creating a blank survey because if you copy from my sample survey, you're going to have to basically delete everything from there. So since you're creating a survey from scratch, I probably recommend creating a blank one, both for your practice one and for the one that will become your actual survey. So once you click blank survey, you should name it. This is that project name I was telling you about that participants will not actually see, so you can name this whatever you want. I wouldn't recommend naming it like group 1 survey because then it'll just be kind of hard for me to find it. I would either name it with the names of the people in your group, or your name if you're working individually, or naming it something having to do with the project idea. So again, social media and self-esteem, that's fine. Just name it something that makes sense to you, because again, participants won't see this, we're just going to see this name. So then from there, once you create a new blank survey, you see this. There's basically going to be nothing there except for a single blank question that you can add into. This will be the screen you see when you're actually in the editing function for your survey. So this is where all the magic happens. Once you create your survey and you click on it, it brings you to this editing dashboard. So the major areas of this dashboard that you're going to want to pay attention to, you've got a variety of functions up top. Most of these are not the main like editing, like programming your questions functions, but the sort of bigger functions like sharing the survey with me, that's in the tools dropdown. Survey options, these are going to be things like publishing it. So some major functions are going to be available up there. Here in the middle, you're going to see the actual questions that you program. You're going to have lots of different options and things you can play around with here. But if you're just programming in all your basic, like multiple choice, Likert scale questions, you're just going to be using this multiple choice option. You have the click to write the question text. So that would be the actual question item. And then click to write the choices. That's your 1 equals strongly agree, 5 equals strongly disagree. So that's where you actually program in the text of the question. Here's where you edit all of the features of the question itself. So you see at the top there, you can change the question type. Not everything is going to be multiple choice. For example, you're going to need static text for when there's instructions. You can have fill in the blank questions. You can have sliding scale questions. There's lots of different questions types. Again, I would recommend playing around, looking at the different question types and just getting a feel for the different sorts of things you can do in Qualtrics. The vast majority of the questions you create will be multiple choice, but that doesn't mean it's not a good idea to get a feel for what different questions can look like. The choices, that's where you program in the number of response options that participants have. So if you're programming in a 1 to 5 scale, you would have 5 choices. Single versus multiple answer, you're typically going to want to keep single answer because you want participants to choose a single response that applies to them. But if, for example, you had a checklist, you could enable multiple answers. Position, vertical versus horizontal, that's just the positioning of the question. This is really just an aesthetic distinction. So you can see that first question automatically programs as vertical, up and down. I might recommend playing around between horizontal and vertical because for a lot of multiple choice questions, in my opinion, horizontal looks a lot better because you sort of maximally use the space on the screen. As you can see, there's all this dead space over here. That's what your survey is going to end up looking like. So if this was to be horizontal, it sort of fills in the space a little bit better, but this is a bit of an aesthetic choice. Validation options, this is pretty important. There you have the option to force your participants to respond to any given question. If you click on any specific question and select force response, participants will not be able to proceed to the following screen before providing an answer. I don't necessarily recommend using force response because you do want to let participants skip questions that they want to skip. But if you click on that, you'll notice that there will be a drop-down menu if you click that little down arrow, and you can select request response. That is my recommendation because what that does is it prompts participants to take a look at any questions they skipped. The vast majority of times participants skip a question is not because they find it upsetting, it's because they just didn't notice it. So request response calls to their attention any things they may have inadvertently skipped. If they truly do not want to answer the question, they can then disregard that message. Some other options like adding a page break. This means that when participants get to that point where there's a page break, it will have them go from one screen to the next. Skip logic, this is basically if they select a certain option, they can skip to another part of the survey. You're going to use at least one of those. Lots of different functions are available throughout this toolbar over here. So a lot of the programming you're going to do when you're making your survey is going to happen over here. You can additionally create new questions, and you can import questions from pre-existing surveys. This is where I would recommend drawing from my sample survey, because you can click import questions from, and you can select specific blocks from my sample survey to copy in their entirety. So for example, if you like my demographic section, you can just import that entire block at once, and that is completely fine to do. I'm giving you full permission to pick from my sample survey. So for the consent, the debrief, the demographics, all that stuff is going to look basically exactly like it will for your survey. So you can definitely import that stuff from my sample. But if you want to create a new question from scratch, that's where you do that. And then preview. I recommend doing this often. This will show you what participants will see in your survey. So even do this for your little practice survey. This again gives you a sense of what the survey actually looks like when participants are going to see it. So it's very valuable after you accomplish some programming to see what it actually is going to look like when it's in its final form. So now I'm going to show you some screenshots from a sample survey before then popping into the sample survey and showing you a few things. So in some screenshots from the sample, right, the first thing is going to be your consent form block. Previewing this sample survey will again show you what participants are going to see. So this would be the first screen that they see. You get a preview that would be the preview that people on a laptop or desktop computer would see, and then to the right you see the mobile preview, so that's really great. One thing you're going to need to have in your consent form is a skip logic where they have to consent based on all the information on the consent page. So basically they need to indicate that they consent based on all the information on this consent page and that they're over 18 years of age. We cannot have any under 18 participants in our data collection. The skip logic you're going to need to use is if anyone clicks I do not consent, it boots them to the end of the survey. Again, if you look at my sample, you'll see how to program in that skip logic. But basically, you click on this question, you add a skip logic, and then you can set that anyone who clicks I do not consent gets moved right to the end. So you need to have that. If someone were to click I do not consent, they again see the very end screen. If they click that they do consent, it would take them to the actual questions that you've programmed in the survey. So here, for example, is what they see when there's static text. So there's general instructions for the whole survey. Here's my instructions for the first scale, and then the actual questions of the scale themselves, the question or item text, and the response format. Participants will then make their selections. Depending on the force response or request response setting that you choose, participants will either see, please answer this question if they skip it, or if you did request response, which again is my recommendation, they'll just see a message letting them know that they skipped a question and do they really want to proceed without answering. So there's different ways to program your questions. It doesn't all need to look the same. Again, there's some aesthetics at play here in terms of what you think looks best. So this, for example, is a different way that you can program in your multiple choice questions that uses what we call a matrix. As you can see, these questions have the items listed down this way. And there's one single consistent response format that participants see at the top. And that text for the response format is not listed underneath every question. So it sort of saves some space. It saves them from having to reread your response format over and over and over. So this can be a great choice if you think there's sort of few enough questions here that participants will be able to see this pretty easily as they're reading through the questions in case they want to refer back to it. So a matrix can be a great way to kind of make it slightly easier to program because you just have this one matrix, this one response format, and then the items listed downwards. I can show you how to do a matrix format as opposed to this. It's pretty easy. Okay, and so then this screen is the very last thing participants should see before the very end of the survey. This is the debriefing page. This is again static text, but this needs to be the very, very end of your survey. So this is an important setting to choose. This collaborate dropdown used to be its own dropdown menu, but I'm pretty sure that in the current version of Qualtrics, it's in this tools dropdown menu. So if you go to tools and there's this collaborate function in the dropdown menu, this is very important that you go to collaborate and you add me and your group mates to collaborators on the survey shell that you create, that you will be turning into your final survey. You don't need to share your practice survey with me. That's just sort of for you. But when you go and you create that survey and you say, this is what we're ultimately going to be programming into, type my username in here. Type the username of your group mates. You got to click add. You got to give full privileges here. So check every single one of these options for me and your group mates. That means both me and all your group mates will be able to do everything: edit, share it, copy it, download the data. We want everyone to have the same privileges on the survey, me included, because that's going to be important for when you need my help editing, downloading the data, etc. And then after you do that, make sure you click save, because if you just exit this screen, it will not save those updated collaborator settings. So again, very, very important. Do not neglect this step, because if you don't have me or your group mates as collaborators on what becomes your final survey, it's going to be harder for everyone to contribute. So then ultimately sharing your survey is going to be super easy. You can get an anonymous link that you can post on your Facebook page or your Snapchat, whatever you kids are using. I know I've had students in the past share their survey link on Reddit, or honestly, I don't know. I hear Snapchat a lot. I'm not sure how that works, but you can share it anywhere. You can email it. You can just send it to people you know. You can send it to whoever, just real casual. Send it to whoever you think might be willing to take it. Okay, so in terms of the process of creating your survey in Qualtrics, right, you should create a blank survey, experiment with creating different blocks. You don't want the entire survey to be on a single page, because participants will get there, see that it's one massive page and be like, screw this, this looks way too long. Create different pages, make sure that your survey is split up into at least a few different pages. Add questions to your blocks, which constitute a single page or screen. Preview constantly to see what your work actually looks like and what participants will be seeing. Make sure to have a consent form. Make sure you have a debriefing. One thing to note is that your demographic questions should be the last part of the survey before the debriefing. Do not put the demographic information at the beginning. Make it be the last questions participants respond to. Make sure to share your survey as collaborators with me and with your group mates, and then also look at the distribution functions, see how you create the anonymous link and all that stuff. And then in that top toolbar, there's a place where you can actually make the survey live, which you'll need to do once it's finalized and you want to begin collecting data. We can cross that bridge when we come to it, but again, I would just encourage you to get in there and look at all the different functions and play around. Okay. So some of the real basic question types that you're going to want to get some practice with. There's going to be some static content, so all instructions are going to be static text. You can always add pictures. I don't know that any of you need to add pictures, but you can do that. Question types, right? Any sort of survey questionnaire type is in there. Multiple choice, fill in the blank, slide rule. There's a lot. So just look around at the different question types and then look at the overall questionnaire surveys. So the skip logic, the survey flow, and naming questions. I'm going to show you this in the sample survey. This is one of those little nitpicky things that you might think sounds unimportant, but I'm going to show you what it is. And trust me, it is important at the end of the day. And then start getting a feel for the aesthetics. So by previewing the survey with different question like settings, vertical, horizontal, different font sizes. You could change the background. You can do all sorts of aesthetic stuff to make your survey look cool. All right, any questions so far before I move on to show you my sample survey and walk you through it just a little bit? We good? All right. So now let me show you the sample survey that I made available to anyone who the system enabled me to, basically anyone who already had their experimenter privileges granted. Okay, so this here is my sample survey, and it basically has most of the sort of content you're going to ultimately need to include in your survey. So the consent form, things you're going to need to do in here where if you copy this from the sample survey, you're going to need to add your names here, and you're going to need just a very, very short description of the survey. This does not have to give the full hypothesis of your survey. It should be a little bit more vague. So for example, if your project is on self-esteem and social media, you can say, the purpose of this study is to explore the relationship between social media use and feelings or attitudes. Something maybe a little bit more vague so that they don't know exactly what the survey is about. Okay, so in this same block, meaning that all of this is on the same page that participants see, I have my consent form and I have the consent question. So this here is static text. This here is a multiple choice question where participants have the option of selecting consent or I do not consent. I added a skip logic indicating that participants who select I do not consent, they skip to the end of the survey. This would be an example of a question where you need to force response. Okay, participants need to complete this consent question in order to proceed. So this is an example of a question where you do need to put that force response option onto. I got a page break and then on to the next block. So this is the first block of actual questions of the survey. So I'm going to point out several things here that I'd like you to notice. One is that I have a name for the block itself. That's just for you. Again, participants are not going to see that. Here I have some general instructions for the entire survey. I elected to have that on a separate page entirely. So participants will see this on one screen, and then given that I inserted a page break, which you can do in the options here, this is actually on a separate screen from this. So you can elect to have this and this on the same page, or you can have it be on a different page. That's kind of up to you. So then on to my first scale. So I've got my scale instructions. I like that. I named here the actual question. This is not a question, it's just static text, but technically Qualtrics considers it a question and I named it. Again, that's mostly just for you. Participants will not see that. They will only see this. So then this is the actual first question of the survey. Again, notice that there's question text, there's my response format. I chose to have this on a 1 to 7 scale, and I chose to put the actual response anchors, like the actual language indicating what these options mean above every single response point. Some scales will only have the anchor listed above like the lowest, the highest, and the middle. Again, that's kind of up to you. If you're using a pre-published scale, likely they will have some indication of what sort of a response format you can use. 1 to 5, 1 to 7, having anchors over every point or just 3 points, kind of up to you. Forced response is selected, but again, if I wanted to make sure that participants could skip it if they want to, you can switch to request response. I have it horizontal because I think that looks a little bit better. So again, you can play around with programming the question with all of these tools over here. And now here's that point I made about naming your variables. And again, this is misleadingly important. You might think to yourself, okay, who cares? Naming my variables doesn't sound that important. Participants are not going to see this label here associated with this question. So you're going to want to name it some shorthand that makes sense to you. This scale, for example, is the contingencies of self-worth scale, so I named it CONT. So it's like a series of whatever, 30 questions, so I named it CONT1, CONT2, CONT3, CONT4, so on and so forth. I highly recommend naming your variables something like that. This is going to make your life 1,000 times easier when we get to data analysis. The reason is because when you download your data from Qualtrics, this name here will be at the top of the column where all of this data is present. So when you download this data from Qualtrics, there's going to be a column in there that says CONT1, and that column is going to be full of a series of values, and that's your actual raw data that participants gave you. If you fail to name this something that indicates what question it was and what scale it was a part of, Qualtrics is going to call it Q1, Q2, Q3, so on and so forth. Now that becomes problematic when you get to your next scale and it's then named like Q45, Q46, Q47, you're going to be like, what's Q1, what's Q45? It's going to be hard to keep track. I'm highly stressing the importance of naming all of the variables in your scales a similar shorthand and having a different separate shorthand for your second scale. Again, you might think to yourself, this can't be that important. Trust me when I say, when you download your data and every single bit of raw data is named Q1 through Q65, you're gonna be like, this sucks. We would be able to fix it at that point, but just save yourself the headache now and name all of your variables here. Now I mentioned this matrix format. Okay, so that's this. Again, you can get the matrix table by changing the question type, and that's what enables you to make something that looks like this. Again, if it's kind of a short-ish scale, where participants will be able to easily see the response format with all of the questions so that they don't have to scroll back up to see what the response options are, a matrix is a pretty good move. It's a good move because it might be a little bit easier to program, and in terms of this variable naming piece, I just named this entire matrix body est. This is the body esteem scale, so I named the whole thing body est. When I download my data, those columns are still going to be named, and this one is going to be named bod est 1. This is going to be bod est 2. So doing a matrix saves you from having to name all of your variables, all of your questions one at a time. So it's not a bad idea to play around with the matrix format. This is another scale that I programmed in a matrix format, but this one is on a 1-to-7 scale. Again, you can mess around with the number of responses even if you're using this matrix format. So then my last questionnaire block is my demographics, which again should be the very last thing before the debriefing. Again, name your variables. So gender, just name it gender. Age, just name it age. You don't need to name your demos, demo 1, demo 2, demo 3, because again, these are sort of standalone variables. Just name them something that makes sense to you. I tend to have these 2 questions in all of the surveys I make. I would say it's not a bad idea to copy these into your survey as well. Just gives participants an opportunity to indicate their thoughts about the study and what they think the study was about. And then my debriefing block. Again, there's this little bracket here where you want to fill in a description of your survey's purpose and your more specific research hypothesis. So this would be where you do explicitly tell your participants, this study was about the relationship between social media and self-esteem. We predicted that higher social media use would be negatively associated with self-esteem. So this is when you can give up the ghost and tell participants what your hypothesis was. I think one last thing that I will point out is this little thingy, this little wheel here. There's a series of options here that I would encourage you to take a look at. You can add your skip logic from here, so that's great. One thing though that I'm definitely going to be looking at before I approve your finalized survey, and I recommend you take a look at, is this recode values function. Okay, so when you download your data from Qualtrics, you're going to be downloading a bunch of numerical quantitative information. All of the information that participants gave you when they responded to this gender question will be a series of 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. What you're going to want to do is look at these recode values, because when you have all that quantitative information and you then go to copy and paste it into SPSS, you're going to want to know that anyone who indicated a 1 was male, 2 was female. This is additionally going to be quite important for all your scales themselves, because again, you're going to want that recoding value to make sense. Now, typically, when you're writing in a multiple choice question like this in Qualtrics, Qualtrics will automatically set the recode values to be what they're supposed to be, right? Anyone who wrote a 1, you're gonna see a 1 in your data set. This is one of those things that I can't explain, and I don't know why. Every once in a while, Qualtrics wants to play some games, and when you create a question, you will not have touched the recode values, but for some reason, this recode will not say 1 through 7, it'll say like 5 through 12, for no reason whatsoever. I don't know why. It's one of those things that for some reason is a flaw in Qualtrics. So check that recode value thing, and if it looks like fuckery, we want to fix it before your survey goes live. So definitely take a look at that recode value option as well, because we don't want any nonsense going on with your quantitative variables either. Okay, I think that that's basically all I have for you guys in terms of training you up on Qualtrics. Again, it's a pretty user-friendly platform, so just get in there and practice, play around, create different sorts of questions, and then your goal for today is just to create your survey shell that will turn into the real thing. You don't have to add anything to it at this point. You just need to have made the survey that will turn into the real thing. Beyond that, just get some practice and make sure that you become a Qualtrics programming expert, which again, it's not the hardest platform in the world. You just need to get a little bit of practice to get acquainted with it. Okay.